So welcome to episode 116 of Silver Lining for Learning, taking a venture into Eduventures. If you are a higher education institution with questions about adult learner demand or traditional student demand, or the need for recruitment on your campus, or are trying to understand new and emerging trends and technologies, or facing some kind of programmatic challenges and initiatives or any other kinds of challenges, our guests today are people who've been dealing with such things and much, much more, which we'll get to in the next hour. Kim Reid is the principal analyst with Eduventures. She studies traditional student demand as well as pricing and value and many, many other things, and was a student in my learning theories class, we think, back in 1995. So she's living proof that I've been teaching for more than a quarter century. Can I make it another quarter century? We'll see. And our other guest, Richard Garrett, also I met almost a quarter century, about 22 or so years ago when he worked with the Observatory for Borderless Higher Education, where he was looking at the global demand for online education around the world. And now he's the Chief Research Officer of Eduventures, and he looks at policy and many other things there, and they can both get into their bios a little bit more. I think Richard's background's in the UK, maybe with a certificate at King's College along the way. And Kim's got a background at Indiana University and other places along the way as well. So Richard and then Kim, you want to fill in a little bit about your journey from the UK to the US and, you know, the 25 odd or so years you've been working as a researcher and looking at trends in education in general and how it's evolved. Richard?
Sure. Thanks, Kurt. Very pleased to be here. So yes, I've been involved in higher education research policy consulting for about 25 years. The first part of that was in the UK, where I'm from, and then from 2005 here in the US. And I stumbled into, in the late 90s, the early days of online learning. And what attracted me to it was because it seemed very new, very young, but also likely to get more and more significant. And as a young researcher, I felt unencumbered by a lot of received wisdom and extensive literature, and felt I had an opportunity to say something sooner rather than later. So I latched onto it eagerly, and the US was always where things were happening, where the market was biggest and most innovative. So I watched it from the outside for about 10 years, and then convinced Eduventures to hire me for my first stint at the company. And they brought me over, and I helped set up the online higher education learning collaborative. So this is a partnership for colleges and universities that were interested in online, to get a handle on market trends, operational trends, regulation, and so on. I did that for a while. Then I left and did more international things. And then Eduventures, under a new guy, said, why don't you come back, be chief research officer and do some of the same things. So I decided, yes, I'll come back. And the company's now part of a couple of bigger companies, Encora, which used to be called NRCCUA. And now that combined entity is part of ACT, best known for the standardized college admissions test. So I still specialize in online learning, adult learners, non-traditional credentials providers, some internationalization. But as predicted, online goes from strength to strength. COVID's only accelerated that, but we'll see quite what that means. But my day job is helping all kinds of colleges, from the most online to those just getting their feet wet, to really be strategic about the modality, not just imitate others, not just follow fashions, but really figure out where online fits into their institutional mission and identity. So happy to go into more of that, but that's how I ended up in the US and in online higher ed.
So Richard's background is at King's College as well as Cambridge. I've spoken at both, as well as Surrey, where he was a researcher for a while. And Kim was at Syracuse, Duke, and then Indiana. Some travels now. And where do you live now, Kim?
I live in Concord, Massachusetts.
Okay.
So close to home for me. So I always grew up in Massachusetts. Mm-hmm.
So
But I
you
like
want
to
to tell
say
us,
that
fill in a little more on that?
Sure, sure. So I like to say that I've definitely taken a tour of Division I basketball school, so that was really important to me, obviously. But otherwise, I like to say that if you look back at my career, I've really been involved in education writ large. So I was bit by the bug in terms of education research when I was at Syracuse University, and decided to continue on for in a PhD program at IU, where I ran across Kurt Bonk there, which is fantastic. But my early research was in the domain of K-12 school reform and how technology was applied to K-12 school reform in the mid-90s, before we had the internet, even when schools were just wiring for the internet. I also was involved in some early distance learning projects in the School of Continuing Education at Indiana University as well. Cut my teeth a little bit also on some multicultural education and training. And then in 2007, really found Eduventures and became involved in enrollment management and in research, looking at recruiting and retaining students. And along the way, I also have a double secret history. I was a high performance tennis coach as part of it. So, what really drew me to working with colleges and universities and thinking about enrollment management, specifically focused on traditional undergraduate students, was a nice combination of really understanding youth development and students that I'd spent a lot of time with on tennis courts and thinking about their future in college. And really, a lot of the work that I do in Eduventures is surveying students and trying to understand what's going on in the mind of a 17 or 18-year-old student who's thinking about deciding on college. And then when we learn from that information, how do we work with our university clients to help them think about how they're positioned to serve traditional undergraduates? How should they be recruiting and communicating with those students? What should they be doing to retain and make those students successful at their institutions? And like Richard, I've had 2 stints at Eduventures. I was there from 2007 to 2011, worked for a company called McGuire Associates for 3 years, and then came back in 2015 and have been part of this kind of fun rocket ship ride with NCORA and ACT as well. So it's really wonderful to be here. Thanks for having me on.
So since you've both been doing stints at Eduventures, and we'll have people watching this who are thinking about career opportunities in the field, what attracted you each to Eduventures? What was really interesting to you the first time around? What got interesting the second time around?
Well, from my point of view, as you said, Kurt, I'd worked in higher ed in a number of settings. I'd worked in a policy setting for what's now the Quality Assurance Agency for Higher Education, a bit like a US accreditor. And I'd also worked in the School of Education at the University of Surrey. So I tried out policy, educational research, academic educational research. And then when I went to the observatory, I was closer to what you might call business education research. And I found that particularly energizing because it meant there was a little more freedom around style and method that I quite liked. And there was also a sense of a more tangible audience for the output. There was typically some client who wanted to understand something, was going to act on the results. And I quite liked taking the sophistication of the academic research and the policy research, but translating into something tangible, real-time, actionable. So Eduventures, to me, when I was in the UK, that it didn't seem to be anything quite like Eduventures, a commercial entity that was dedicated to high quality research and consulting, specializing in education and all kinds of novel forms of education, adult learners, online learning. Eduventures was only founded in the mid-90s, so it was still a pretty young company when I was first getting to know it. But I felt like I was the classic liberal arts graduate. I did religious studies as my major in college at King's and my master's degree. So I'd been taught how to write well, how to think critically, etc., how to deal with different sources. But then I liked translating it into this more business applied environment. So Eduventures to me was a chance to do that with colleagues, with other researchers at scale in America, which to me was where everything was happening in the online world. So that, I suppose I've helped the company, evolve its own identity over those years, but to me, it still embodies that freshness, that newness, that appetite for change and innovation, but also what I like about Eduventures is that it's not faddish, it's not self-serving, it's not just running around chasing money. It has a critical voice, it has a skeptical voice, and I think the longer I've been in this business, the more I valued that perspective to say, I can remember something like this happening before. Let me judge today versus that benchmark. So that's why I think I'm, perhaps to my surprise, still at Eduventures after all the time.
Yeah, and I think that my story is somewhat similar to Richard's. When I was a student at IU, I had an opportunity to go for a year to the Children's Television Workshop, now Sesame Workshop, and participate in a graduate student fellowship there. And I really fell in love with applied research at that moment in time. It's like, okay, I'm going to do research that's going to immediately impact the production of this television show, or the continued funding of this television show, all of those types of things. So when I went back to IU after that program, I really just went into full gear and into learning about education, and combining that with my communications PhD program. And when I really decided to go full bore into research, I found Eduventures and discovered some of the same things that Richard did, is that this is really a place where there were a lot of very passionate and smart people who were working directly with universities to help them improve things for students and improve things for the university. And the other thing is that I really, in my first stint at Eduventures, knew almost nothing about enrollment management. This whole part of the university where we have a number of administrators who are very highly skilled at bringing in the class and balancing out all of the needs of a university when it comes to enrollment. And the first time I was with Eduventures, I really drunk from the fire hose and learned a lot and met incredible people. And then the second time around, I just feel like, we were coming together with NRCCUA, now Incura, and ACT. And from my position as someone who works with traditional aged undergraduates, the availability of the data that we have in working with those two companies gives us millions of students to survey and millions of data points to really look at, and really elevated our research to another level and made it even more interesting and important and useful for our clients than ever before.
Chris is going to jump in here, but he also might want to do a little plug for the Sesame Street show that I think we have coming up, right, Chris?
Well, at the end, I'll do a plug for that.
Oh, it's next week.
No, 2 weeks.
In 2 weeks.
Okay, so at the end of the show, we'll talk about next week and the week after. So for some time, services like yours that look at trends and discontinuities and narratives have had really interesting stories to tell to higher education. The decline of the number of traditional students demographically, the end of geographic monopolies with the rise of online learning, huge demand in continuing education and links to workforce upskilling and reskilling should higher education choose to go into that market. And at least up until the pandemic, my sense was that most institutions in higher education were not listening. I mean, I don't mean that they weren't familiar with what you were doing, but they weren't changing their behavior. My sense was that the attitude was, yeah, everybody else is going to have a downturn in market share, but we're so good and we're so smart that we can swim against the tide and have a larger piece of a shrinking pie. When I gave keynotes face to face, one of the lines I would use to a higher education audience is, it's easier to move a cemetery than it is to change a university. And then I would pause and I would say, even though the two involve similar skills. And it always got kind of an appreciative laugh from the audience, a rueful laugh, if you will, because they knew how hard it really is. So am I too negative about how strong the barriers to change, to evidence-based change, are in higher education, or at least were before the pandemic? And do you see that changing at all with the incredible disruptions that have happened in recent years?
Well, let me comment, and then I'll see what Kim thinks. So I'd say yes, there's some truth to what you're saying. And I think it partly reflects that institutions tend to be very decentralized, and whoever we may happen to be talking with, whoever may have contracted with Eduventures, occasionally it's the president's office, but more often than not, it's the continuing ed division or the online learning division or enrollment management division. And they will always come with certain challenges and problems, but will often also highlight caveats to say, well, we don't control X or Y. We can't tell the faculty what to do when it comes to programming. Say, we'd love it if they got rid of these programs or added these programs or enhanced those programs. So I think it's emblematic of the decentralized nature of higher ed and that sort of cultural instinct that even things like online learning, in my view, have had to accommodate in order to progress at many schools, rather than impose some sort of radical alternative. I think you can definitely find exceptional institutions that have followed the data and gone out on a tangent that has allowed them to be ahead of the curve or very distinctive, but by definition they are exceptional. And I would say during COVID, post-COVID, I would say we're getting and seeing more acute stress from more institutions, and therefore perhaps, at least from those who can see things perhaps more clearly, a greater desire to say we really can't go on like this. We really need to balance, say, our core business with a complementary market, say adult learners versus traditional, or online versus face-to-face. But I've also been part of conversations where say a VP or two seem to really get it, but trying to convince the president that this is a priority when he or she are battling with fundraising and trustees and parents and so many things that seem more immediately urgent, but perhaps are not recognizing the writing on the wall. And I think COVID is, coming out of COVID, we're in a weird sort of, can we breathe a sigh of relief and go back to normal type sentiment? The problems are somehow behind us. And everything that maybe didn't seem so good back in 2019 now looks through rose-tinted spectacles to have been absolutely fine by comparison. Mm-hmm. Or a sense of, okay, we really are, we've been shoved further towards the future faster than we expected, and they're either sort of energized by that or paralyzed by that. Yeah. So I think in a way it's still early coming out of COVID. What does it really mean? But I suspect I'm sensing, a bit more urgency, but I don't know that there's any clearer way of overcoming that cultural inertia, that decentralization that hampered institutions before the pandemic, and I think it'll keep on hampering them, for a good time soon, good time longer.
Yeah, I mean, I think Chris, you're very correct in many ways, but I would also say that there are a lot more institutions now that know they have to change than in the past. They just don't know how to do it, right? And there's a much smaller set of institutions that know that they have to change and they know how to do it, right? And I think that this is very typical when you have this kind of event, which we haven't had very often, obviously. But if you go back to the last sort of crisis in higher education, it would have been the economic downturn in 2009, 2010. And you could say the same thing is true for this pandemic as was true then. Is what happens is you have a number of institutions that begin to do the things that they always should have been doing, right? So that's what's happening. Oh, we should have paid more attention to recruiting. We should have paid more attention to student success. We should have paid more attention to thinking about innovating into hybrid means of learning. And now everybody's been forced into it. And in fact, if you kind of look at our institutions that we've been working with over the last few years, there are institutions that, because of COVID, were able to do things in 6 weeks that would have taken them 3 or 4 years to do in the past. So there has been some shaking loose of institutions as part of this pandemic. But I think the other thing that you always see whenever there's a crisis in higher education is that some institutions will rise out of this occasion. They will have had a really great president, really great leadership. They will have undergone some transformation, and we'll see sort of the new stars arise in 2 or 3 years because of the pandemic. And then I also think as you look down the line, maybe it'll take 4 or 5 years, we'll really see the institutions that didn't make pivots, and those will be the ones that go out of business or merge and don't make the long-term recovery from COVID.
Just to quickly add, another predictor of that is which institutions are now trying to click their ruby slippers and go back from Oz to Kansas in
Right.
2019,
Mhm.
and which institutions are doing what I talk about in my new article, a sea change,
Yes.
where we're in Oz now. We're not going back to Kansas. You
Exactly.
have to go into the learning business instead of the education business.
Right. Yeah, I think you're right about that. I in no instance do I think we're going back to the way it was. And I think the question is really helping our clients understand what is the future going to look like and in which direction they need to move. Mhm.
Yeah, and I think that learning education distinction is surprisingly, unsurprisingly, still kind of at the heart of the matter, but also it still remains or can be seen to be a rather subtle distinction. These words are used interchangeably, and yet I agree with you that for institutions to take learning seriously, sort of rekindle the essence of their mission and somehow distinguish it from all the accumulated processes and norms that have, inevitably come to characterize what they do. And I think online in particular, as I said, online has had to navigate institutional culture and accommodate institutional culture. And I've talked about this idea of, is online energy being domesticated by higher ed? Who's the more powerful force? Is it the legacy culture that's going to fragment online into something palatable, or is online more powerful when it will overcome institutional culture? But I think that's another way of phrasing that, I suppose, is sort of education versus learning. Not to say that the disruptive potential of online can't be more education than learning. It often has been that. But I think the way I think about it is we're encouraging schools to try and transcend these labels of campus and online and really start from the question of what pedagogy delivery mode combination is the right one for the particular learning objectives we're trying to pull off. And then if you start there and work backwards, you'll probably end up with something much more effective, much more distinctive, much more enduring than if you start the other way around, or just work with these labels. Is it online or is it on campus?
And I think that, to Richard's point, I think that poses a difficulty in the traditional undergraduate market, right? So if we look at our students and how our students feeling about their upcoming college education, there's a lot of desire to go back to the way it was among high school students, right? They did not have a good time in online high school. They don't think that they learned well in that environment that they had in high school. And so when they look forward to college, they're really yearning for a lot of traditional 4-year education experience. Now, the reality is we're not going back to the way it was for multiple reasons. And one of the reasons is we can probably deliver a better learning experience if we take all of the tools we use to teach students, traditional undergraduate students during the pandemic, and say which ones were really effective in creating a great learning environment for students. And then, sort of move forward with that and not talk about that as online learning, because that's kind of a dirty word with traditional undergraduates, but just it has to happen. We have to innovate the undergraduate experience. It will involve a lot of hybrid or high flex learning, but students don't necessarily need to know that as they go through their college choice.
And so I was going to ask several questions, or I have several questions set up, but I'm going to skip the first one for now because the second one ties into what Chris is talking about here. And you opened up some things there, Kim, because we had a show on high flex earlier and blended learning. We've had several, in fact.
Right.
And one of the founder of the high flex model, Brian Beatty, is a grad of our program at IU. So go IU there. So, but everyone has him on the dartboard with his picture because they all hate high flex. And so I told Brian, yeah, you got to duck when you show up at conferences. But I'm curious about how the questions have changed from your first stint at Eduventures to now, and now especially post pandemic related questions, how the questions change, because you said you should have, people should have. And, they should have been doing more with blended learning. They should have been doing more with technology innovations for multiple access and addressing diverse learners, diversity, equity, inclusion. They should have been more focused on well-being, and the depression studies. In fact, I've got a couple that we've recently done. So can you talk to us about that? What questions are they asking? As part of that, maybe you can tell us about current reports that you've been doing and working on, and how people might be able to access those current reports. So how have the questions changed over time, and what are you currently doing, and all that stuff?
I mean, I'll jump in there first because I have some interesting stories on that. So when I first started at Eduventures in 2007 and was part of the Enrollment Management Learning Collaborative, we wanted to do a study among our member universities that asked questions about educational return on investment. And people were upset by that. They're like, we cannot use the words return on investment. The faculty will be angry. There's no such thing as educational value. So that's changed tremendously, right? Because now when we do work with our clients, it's almost all about what is the value proposition? What's the value proposition for our university? What's the value proposition for this academic program? What's the value proposition for this individual student in terms of how do we recruit them and also then deliver what that student is promised? The other story I'll tell you too is also back from 2007 in our surveys, people were worried. They're like, I don't know if we should email students because, email is a student space and we've never emailed students before. And this is the constant conversation. So now the conversation is, I don't know if we should be on TikTok. I don't know if we should be on Snapchat, but it's the constant moving line of where are students and how do we reach students and how do we talk to them about the things that are really important. And I'll say just what's sort of on the horizon for us right now, and in terms of enrollment management, is really pushing the next envelope, which is getting institutions to really embrace the fact that parents are an equal partner in college search, right? And to say the family is the unit of recruiting. We can't pretend anymore that the student is doing all of the work and trying to figure out which school to go to. It's actually a very deep conversation with a parent or a guardian. And when we're working with students with students and families to recruit students and get students to come to your university, we really have to elevate the parent as an equal partner in the process. So we have a research report on that that's coming out that's called the Parent-Student Relationship in College Search. And it's all about how do parents and students think alike in terms of their mindset about college? What do they think college is all about? And also in terms of the conversation they have and what do parents think is important? Where do they put their finger on the lever when they're talking with students? How does cost factor in? And really sort of differentiating between messaging and that we can really apply to both parents and students, and differentiated messaging for each of those audiences as well.
Well, I'd say there's been a lot of continuity, I think, in the adult and online space, and that there's certainly questions we're still asking now that we were asking then, just to try and understand appetite to enroll, views of online learning, degree, non-degree. But in terms of some differences, back then, there was definitely much more attention to what do people think of online fundamentally? Do they even buy it as a credible modality? And we used to have a lot of questions trying to tease out how it was perceived versus, had you engaged in it or not? Back then, not many people had done an online course, so you had to try and figure out, was anyone, is anyone speaking from experience? Now that's much less the case. Online is ordinary for many students, at least in principle. And I think the other thing that's changed is that when I first came to Eduventures, the online direction was very much degree centric. It was all about essentially going from courses to full degree programs. Whereas what's happened in the last 2 years, I think, is almost a saturation on the degree front, at least for degrees that make any sense online, particularly at master's level. And now this migration into degree alternatives. And to me, it's taking the logic of online in its current form, which is all about increased flexibility, convenience, cost reduction, either directly or indirectly. And that made online degrees more practical for adults and grad students than conventional degrees. But then we've now migrated into saying, well, perhaps degrees themselves are part of the problem. They're inherently long and expensive. Not everyone completes them. They can often be rather hidebound in terms of their curriculum. Why not have another type of offering that is shorter, more relevant somehow, more timely, even less expensive, and that hence all the boom around micro-credentials of one kind or another. So I think that we spend a lot more time now, and institutions ask us a lot more about, do we really need to pay less attention to online degrees and pay more attention to these alternatives? And what does that mean for a university to be increasingly saying, well, maybe the market, we've already exhausted demand for these degree programs, even though they're online, and now we're in this other world, and that other world is occupied by all kinds of other entities that are not accredited, not universities, don't offer degrees, and are free from arguably some of those constraints. So that arc, I think, is interesting, but I think Kim and I both benefit from having been there at stage one and now are here at stage two, if we can call it that, and hopefully see what stage three looks like.
Yeah.
Do you have any, before Young jumps in here, we're going to have a show in a couple of weeks on micro-credentials. Do you have any reports on micro-credentials we might want to make available for that show? Or are you working on any?
Well, we've, as part of our adult learner surveys, we ask about micro-credentials. So it's a key piece of a number of reports that we published over the last year that look at prospective adult undergrad learners or graduate learners. So it's a slice within that. We're always trying to compare and contrast. I am starting to do some work on the publicly traded companies in this space. So the Coursera, edX now under 2U, Udemy, that kind of entity, where they're now, because they're publicly traded, disclosing all kinds of information about enrollments and finances and margins, not all the detail we would like, but a lot more information than you can often get out of a university doing any of these things, particularly if it's not eligible for federal student aid. It's not going to be an iPad. It's pretty hard to track. So I've been tracking that stuff for a while, and just recently, all of those firms have reported a bit less stellar results on the margin. Either enrollment's up but revenue's down, or revenue's up but enrollment's down. Is it just post-COVID transition? Is it the strength of the dollar, since many of these companies rely on non-US markets primarily, even if the bulk of their content is coming out of the US? The Coursera discounted degree enrollment trend was interesting. Again, enrollment was up, but revenue was down. Are we seeing a reckoning in that space? Is it not going to keep growing as fast as we thought it would? Or is it just a blip? So I'm definitely going to be doing some research in that particular space in a dedicated way, and really taking advantage of all that data that you can get from these companies.
Well, send us that report. Now I think Young's going to jump in here with a question.
So I just want to follow Reid with what Chris was asking about change. But this is really specific to your boss company, like ACT. So I want to deal with the standardized testing. As you know, there were a growing number of universities were testing optional, before COVID, and I think about 1,800 of them. And during COVID, I think it's 90% of the top 100 universities said, testing optional. And toward the end of COVID, most universities still try to keep it testing optional for at least another 2 to 3 years. MIT announced it will go back. The whole UC system has dropped. And of course, during all this fight, there are several things, right? We know both ACT and SAT were not necessarily predicting, successful at high level. I mean, above 0.4%, 0.4. And we know also ACT and SAT have been fighting for the market. We also know there are about 20 states who are stupid enough to have adopted ACT or SAT for high school graduation. Yeah. And so from your really higher education, your research or your observation, both of you, Richard and Kim, can you just tell tell us, first off, I mean, actually, it doesn't really make sense. First off, the racial gap, and by the way, also, I think Harvard and University of North Carolina are now in the Supreme Court. And because there are certain groups like my group, the agents like to say, well, let's go all with test scores. That would just take care of everything. That's the your achievement score. Or it's a very complicated issue. It's political. Right. It's racial. I mean, at this moment, you can definitely say it's very political. And so I was just wondering if you guys have any comments. The reason I'm not trying to say is it going to continue? Is it not going to continue? So what do you see changes or your personal views, opinions? You can declare you're not part of ACT if you want to comment on this. And because this is a very sensitive issue, because at the same time, I have to also highlight a lot of parents still force their kids to take the test. They think it gives them an advantage. This is a whole, it's not one thing, it's too many things, but I think it's from you guys. I would love to hear your expert professional opinion.
Sure, absolutely. It's a very important question, and we're happy to comment. We're totally free to do so. Even ACT's own research shows that the world, post-pandemic is probably moving more test optional than before, right? And when we look at students in our research and ask them, are you interested in taking a standardized test? Will you submit a standardized test to a test optional school, or will you not take the test at all? We still find that there's a lot, there's about 2/3 of students who we would call test confident. These are students who say, I'll take it and I'll submit it, right? And then there's another third of students who are in that position of saying, I don't know if I'm going to take it. If I take it, maybe I won't submit it. And they very strongly relate to just what you're talking about, Young, to students who are in underserved districts, to students who are first generation or low income students. And we're absolutely seeing, more schools say we're going to extend our test optional policy, either make it permanent or extend the experiment another 2 to 3 years. So fundamentally, the environment is moving toward a more test optional environment. Now, that really poses a sort of a problem for the market, in the sense that we now have this question about, well, what is the testing rationale? Why should a student take a test if they take a test, right? We're still seeing that even in test optional schools, somewhere around 50 to 60 to 70% of students, depending on the school, are still submitting a test if it's test optional. So what we fundamentally are recommending to our clients right now is to really think about this environment, to try to understand what role you want testing to play in your admissions. You could be test optional. You could, if you're a school like MIT or an engineering school, you could choose to use tests. But whatever you do, you actually really need to articulate your reasoning very strongly to students, because it's an extremely confusing time for students, right? We used to have a time when there were only these 1,800 test optional schools, and now we have 2,000 test optional, 2,500 test optional schools, and they all have slightly different policies. So how do I know what I'm supposed to do as a student? Am I going to get an advantage? Am I not going to get an advantage? Why would I want to do this? And so wherever we're moving toward, we need universities to be really clear and transparent as to how they will use standardized testing and why, and what it means for students. And I also think that, within our company, within the conversation with ACT, we're really thinking about this. We see what's happening in the student market as well. And we really believe there's fundamental value in the test, certainly to think about placement and understanding student success and things like that, and reformulating again from a corporate position. What will the test mean for students in the future from our position as well?
If I may follow up, Richard, before you, so Kim, I was just wondering about this, is that universities have become what I call a manufactured scarcity. In essence, you could learn a lot of things without going to university, and the credentials have been inflated dramatically. Right. We also look at test scores. If you are, let's say, below, for example, 60 or 70 percentile, and most universities admissions is over 90%, even like University of Kansas, University of Oregon. So I was just don't know what tests actually do. You know, like especially in schools, and now when we deal with the racial mixing, right? If the students we know, let's say African Americans are probably, I don't know how many percentiles below white Americans, Asian Americans, but students actually don't do differently if they're in there. So why do we? Why can't the company say, heck with, let's get rid of it? I'm just curious.
Yeah.
It's just to say, for equity reasons, for actually academic reasons, and for opening up education-wise. I mean, opening universities to have access. So do you have any comments before Richard jumps in?
Well, I mean, the one comment I'll have is that I think that we're arriving at a spot where we realize that tests are not their usage in admissions is, you know, suspect in certain ways that you mentioned, right? But their usage to understand the competence of students is not necessarily, right? So the fundamental problem is now is how we're really removing tests in lots of ways from the admissions process. But there are ways that standardized tests can absolutely help universities in terms of understanding the needs of students and the placements of students. And so I think we're switching gears a little bit in that direction. And also say that even in admissions for certain colleges, standardized tests really do actually make an additive benefit. But it's very important for each university to really look at its own data, right? And to try to understand what has the role been for our university, and are these standardized tests additive in any way? Are they additive for certain programs or for certain types of students? But also, I think that we're really seeing an environment where we're having a more diversified portfolio of ways for students to enter institutions that is more fair and allows students who don't have advantages to come in as well.
Thank you. I actually, this is very helpful. I never heard about this, using it for other than admissions. So that's very helpful. Thank you. Richard.
Yeah, I'll start by saying that growing up in another country that doesn't have these tests, it's clear to me that there's nothing essential about it. You can run a higher education system without these tests and admit students in other ways. You know, in the UK, you're primarily relying on the grades you get in the equivalent of high school. But on the other hand, everyone would also accept to some extent that while there are quasi-national examination bodies in the UK, there's still a lot of variation as to, can we really be sure that an A at this institution is the same as an A at that institution? So the underlying, I get the underlying logic of where the standardized test came from in certain respects, in that to say, well, we've got all this variation, we've got such a huge country, all this state by state control of education, we need some sort of national benchmark to iron out all those differences. But it has all the negatives that you talk about as well. So I agree with Kim that just by taking the test away, it doesn't solve institutions' problems, doesn't solve students' problems. It doesn't magically mean that we know exactly who will do well and who's a good fit at our institution. So I do think, as Kim was saying, these tests can play a role, and have for a long time played a role beyond simply who gets in and who doesn't. It can be to do with placement and field of study and all kinds of things that can help an institution figure out fit for a student. But by their very nature, because we're talking about scale of tests, that tends to mean they have to be multiple choice, which is going to limit the kind of intelligence you can get out of them. You know, they come with all those basic limitations. And I don't think there's a better test that could somehow be created. You know, you occasionally hear about some schools say, well, we'll come up with a better test, but I suspect they'll end up with something, you know, pretty similar, or else it'll be completely boutique and impractical. And I think the other interesting trend, kind of what you were saying, Young, is that we're seeing a little bit of experimentation, flipping the script to say, well, rather than students apply to institutions, why don't institutions in effect apply to students and say, well, if you meet these basic criteria, you know, you've got a high school diploma, whatever it is, for most non-selective institutions, then we'll give you an offer without you having to approach us. And that might just lower the stakes, lower the anxiety, give students a range of options, make them feel wanted rather than all the onus is on them to figure it out. So I don't think we're going to go back, but I don't think tools like the ACT or the SAT will go away entirely. I think they play a role. They are useful under certain circumstances, but institutions should have always been looking at students more holistically, not just relying on the test. You know, if they're overwhelmed with applications, they need some way of sifting them, and they need often an efficient way of sifting them. And if you've got some spectrum of numbers coming back summarizing the abilities of your applicants, then that's a convenience, and I don't think the need for that is going to go away. But because of the racial dimension, you know, other sort of negatives of a, you know, meritocracy, it ends up backfiring, and you don't actually end up necessarily capturing a true account of every student's abilities and potential, and you're excluding as much as including for really no good societal or personal reasons. So I think it's a healthy reckoning with the status quo, but I think it's also a mistake to imagine that the tests were somehow the problem. I think they were a symptom. They were a complicated tool. They had their merits. They had their downside. And I certainly know at ACT, it's creating this very creative sort of moment to say, well, how do we evolve? How do we change? How do we add value? How do we clarify the value of this test and other things that the company does? So I think everyone benefits from this shakeout, but everyone's got a lot of work to do as well to improve on things and not just leave it kind of chaotic and half-baked.
So I know Kim and Chris, I want to jump in. I just want to ask you guys about one thing, that is, I guess, you know, the tests are probably most meaningful at the top 10% of higher education institutions, right? I mean, like really, if they want to fight to get into Harvard or Princeton, they really have to have good scores. I mean, you used to. But really, for most like state colleges, you know, they probably don't really mean much, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's even more sophisticated than that, right? I actually think that, you know, the tests can be very meaningful when you have things like engineering programs, and you need a student to demonstrate that they have strong math skills, right? But when you have a business program where there are more general skills coming in, the test is far less meaningful, and the high school GPA might be more important. So it's some combination of that, Young. It's some combination of the kind of school you are, but also your programs and the kinds of students you're seeking to bring in, all of those things together. But what I would say and add to this is that, and it sort of piggybacks on what Richard was saying about the testing situation being almost symptomatic, is that we're kind of at an inflection point where universities are really having to realize, again, to sort of Chris's point, that their job is to take students and to help them be successful, right? And if you look at all of admissions criteria, right? So you take the tests, you take the GPA, none of them are actually that predictive about actual student success, right? Even the GPA is more predictive than the standardized test, but it's not hugely predictive. What actually helps is when a student is admitted to a university, that they have good advising, great support, that they have great experiences. And so I think we're actually coming to a point where the admissions environment is so crazy, we have to back off of it, right? We have to back off of the race to selectivity, and we have to say, let's educate the students who come to us. There are many deserving students. So say you're an elite institution, for example, and you're only going to admit 5,000 students, but there are 20,000 students who are actually admissible, right? So how do you distinguish? It's actually probably not that meaningful to distinguish, because any one of those 10,000 students would do fine if you supported them. And so, you know, I really feel like we're kind of there where some institutions get that, and they can say, we're not going to spend that much time worrying about splitting hairs here or there. We're going to take the students that we can and make them successful. Now, that's a problem when you're talking about elite institutions, because unfortunately, students really flock to applying to elite institutions. And those institutions have to find ways to sift through the 100,000 applications that they get in a year.
Chris? Or Richard, did you have a?
Well, I was going to make a quick comment that I think another angle is to say, and this is already happening, elite schools arguably need to get bigger to accommodate, you know, if they are the center of the universe when it comes to quality, you know, you could debate that, but if they are, then why not through just incremental expansion? There's some interesting online innovations at some of these schools that have allowed them to expand. I think that's part of the solution, rather than saying, well, we can only be so big, our quality will collapse if we don't hold the line. Why not find more and more ways to grow and accommodate more of this unrelenting demand?
Yeah, well, the Harvard and MIT both, even though they're elite, have some ways beyond tests and standard criteria. The Harvard Extension School has been around for a really long time. I mean, more than half a century, and it has no admissions policy.
Right.
If you have the money, which admittedly is a kind of admissions policy and certainly a discriminatory admissions policy, but if you have the money, you can take any course. And if you pass the course, you pass the course. And if you pass enough courses, you walk out with a Harvard degree in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. It does say continuing education on it, but it's a real Harvard degree. And of course, they've grown much more than the rest of Harvard. In fact, in part because the rest of Harvard caps enrollment, because the brand, involves scarcity. But the fact that they have grown and so many people are getting Harvard degrees says that there's a talent pool out there, that no matter how elite Harvard is, there's people that can do that work. MIT, it's more the MicroMasters, where you take a MOOC for a semester, and if you do well enough in the MOOC, then you're automatically admitted to the master's program that MOOC is based around. So you take 4 MOOCs in the fall, and then you're admitted, and you come to MIT and you take 4 face-to-face courses in the spring. And of course, as you're saying, your performance on those MOOCs or in those continuing ed courses is much more predictive of success than any kind of proxies. So we keep using proxies when we don't have to use proxies.
Right.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the emergence of MOOCs or these other micro-credentials, how they relate to degree programs, and increasingly seeing them as an inexpensive form of marketing, but also an inexpensive way to see what students can do. And you're right, it's a much more direct assessment than in any of these other things. So I do think that while most of this micro-credential stuff is happening at the graduate level, and it is, I think, allowing those more elite programs to scale up, and I think it's opening up the idea that the biggest can often be the best, rather than scale is the antithesis of quality somehow.
Yeah.
But at the undergraduate level, at the traditional student age, where online has been much more piecemeal, and the typical 18-year-old, however non-traditional they are, typically isn't prioritizing online. I'm interested in cases like University of Florida, where their online moved away from the traditional notion of we're going to recruit adult learners and graduate students. We're actually going to deal with this oversubscription to the Gainesville campus amongst 18 to 21-year-olds and use online as almost a waiting list, but try and make that experience as tangible and Gainesville oriented as possible. And then if people do well in that first year, come in the sophomore year, and we'll accommodate you then. So I think more examples of that, sort of taking some of those lessons at the graduate level from online and MicroMasters and starting to apply them at undergraduate level would be a very interesting development.
I just one comment on the undergraduate market as well. Is we spend a lot of time talking about the elite colleges at the undergraduate level, but very few students actually go to those colleges, right? Something like 72% of students go to a public college. We have lots of students as well going to community colleges. And if we look at actually the changed environment pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, the biggest change that we've seen is just the explosion of competitiveness of large public institutions, right? So if we look at the future, I think the institutions we're going to be talking about are going to be the IUs of the world and the University of Florida of the world, who are just big juggernaut institutions who have economies of scale and also have technological expertise and are really able to serve a lot of students, provide programs that are relevant to workforce and employment, provide affordability, provide all the resources that students need. So those are really the institutions to watch in the future.
So I have a kind of a question.
Mhm.
Just feel free to comment. This is more hypothetical and philosophical, because as we know, schools run programs really based on nothing, right? I mean, we say every college has to be 4 years, community college 2 years. Some schools has to be K-12, but in the UK it's K-13. So UK schools 3 years, 4 years. So when you were talking about an A is another A, so really we don't know. Like at Harvard, you run a master's program for 1 year, others run for 3 years. So I was just wondering if anyone is doing any study of all this. Like why suddenly 4 years, 60 credits is good? What about 45 credits or 70 credits? Right? I know there are some experiments and innovations, but how far are schools really innovating? Because really there's no, other than the Carnegie units, other than that, really, we don't have any universal standardized way of talking about those things.
Right. I mean, I'll comment quickly, but I do think schools feel constrained by those norms and what they perceive to be the conservatism of accreditors. There'll never be any simple way to say, well, is my 3-year degree from King's College London as good as Kim's 4-year degree from Duke? How could you ever, she's got an extra year. I don't know. Is that enough? I don't know. Actually, when I came to the States, somebody before I could be given a visa, Eduventures actually employed some academic to turn my 3-year degree into some sort of US equivalent so the US could make sense of it. But it was just an exercise. So I don't think we'll ever be able to fix those things. But I do agree with you that there's this sacred cow nature of 4-year degrees, particularly for someone like me who did a 3-year degree, and I don't think I suffered from it. And the insistence in the US on we must have general education for 2 years, otherwise this person isn't educated. In the UK, you don't do general education. You did that in high school. You specialize from the beginning. You can still do a range of courses, but again, I don't think I'm too hard done by as a result. So I think in a mass higher education system or universal higher education system, we've got to get more creative about length and nature. And I think we're seeing the effects of not doing that. I think we're reaching a point where it simply costs too much in time and money and risk for more marginal prospects to say, I'm going to do something else. And maybe they're smart to do it, but the rise of registered apprenticeships, that's scaling up in an interesting way. All these micro-credentials, other more work-connected forms of training and hiring, they're essentially saying the bachelor's degree is not a good fit for a big chunk of the population. And unless institutions decide to offer bachelor's and alternatives and take more market share, their share is going to go down. And I think we're already beginning to see that.
Yeah, I mean, on that topic, Richard, if we look at our pre-pandemic and post-pandemic data on the students who are in the traditional college-bound pipeline, we have a generation of lost students, right? And those lost students are first-generation students, low-income students, underrepresented minority students. And the question is, well, where have they gone? Have they looked at higher ed and said, it's just not affordable? I can't do it. We're in a really strong job environment. Or have they gone straight to jobs? Have they decided to go into trades or apprenticeships? We don't really know, but they're not there anymore. It's actually changed the nature of the students that we're working with. And the big question for institutions coming out of the pandemic is, how are we going to reconnect to these students? And part of that might be program innovation to address those questions that you just raised.
Young, you have a comment before my final question?
No, I was just going to tell Richard that my daughter went to University of Edinburgh. She spent 3 years, then she spent another year. She got a master's degree, which she come back to America. Nobody recognizes that. But anyway, just want to let you know that.
Love that place. So, I've been curious since we started. We just have a minute left here, so it'll have to be a short answer. But I've been curious, since you did 2 stints, how's skills that are required by you Because people watch this show and say, what can I do what they're doing? How can I get a job like theirs? So give us 3 or 5 skills that maybe were in the past would work, but maybe today might have changed. What would those 3 or 5 skill bases that they would need? What kind of courses do they need to ramp up to do what you're doing?
Well, I'd actually say I think there's a lot of continuity, and I think it boils down to really strong writing skills. Write to be read, to be heard, to take action, and then a sort of perseverance, just being willing to deal with messy data, incomplete answers, and just keep plugging away at it until you find the illumination that makes sense of it. And I think those things are timeless. I'm not quite sure how you teach them, but I think I definitely picked them up somewhere in university.
Yeah, and I would to add to that, I think the research skills are just the baseline of what we need, because really what we're doing is we're advising clients in really difficult times. So I would say that where I've needed to have more skill in the last few years has really been to hear the problems of clients, right? And to really hear some of the political problems of clients within their institutions, and to understand what information do I have that is going to help this client solve a problem, and how am I going to communicate that? So I would say we're a lot less researchy than we were 25 years ago. We're much more advisory, and we're much more really trying to give our clients, the information they need right now to make a decision that has to go to the board or the president. And it's those kinds of skills, communication skills, and talking with senior leaders and in presenting to boards that are really, really critical for us to make sure that the research that we do is actually heard and understood and used.
It's good, Kim, that you're using your IU communication background. We'll have to talk about that sometime. So Richard and Kim, this has been delightful for the past hour. We've all learned a lot. People who watch the show afterwards will also be picking up on things and maybe contacting you, finding out how they can access some of your reports that might be open access and so forth. Send us the report you're doing on vendors in this space, because I for one want to read what their enrollments are and what's happening there. But I think Chris is going to be introducing the next 2 shows, right, Chris?
So next week we're having a hosts reflect show where the 4 of us step back from a series of episodes and think about what it might mean, and then 2 weeks from today, we're having a show on Sesame Street, which is now an international phenomenon with a lot of work in developing countries and with students like refugees. And not only to celebrate Sesame Street, but to ask if others want to follow a model of early childhood education at scale using media. What are some of the pieces of advice that Sesame Street might have? So